In 1783, former officers, revolutionary officers, set up what was known as the Society of the Cincinnati. It was set up as an honorary organization to honor the service of the officers. There was, according to E. Kirch, almost at once the society was criticized as an attempt to establish the former revolutionary officers as a hereditary aristocracy. Now, there's a public distrust that even these officers getting together and setting up this society because they thought, okay, this is the beginning of an elite class, and they feared for their liberty. You know, remember eternal vigilance? They actually took that seriously back then, eternal vigilance. And when Jefferson said in the Kentucky resolutions that the proper attitude of a free people toward the government is one of jealousy, not confidence, these guys, you know, he was reflecting what the people of his time felt. Not trust and confidence, jealousy. In other words, jealousy like, what's it going to take of mine? Namely, how safe is my liberty with this thing around? That was the proper attitude. You can imagine someone going on Fox News and talking this way. Would he even get a sentence out before being interrupted? Of course not. And he wouldn't be invited back. There was a huge protest against, according to E. Kirch, the volume of protests soon reached impressive proportions, protesting the Society of the Cincinnati. Look that up on Wikipedia sometime. Well, we know that at the Constitutional Convention, I've got to watch my time here, the Constitutional Convention, the Anti-Federalists, the Anti-Militarists did manage to get some protections in, not everything, but they at least divided up the powers. Congress is supposed to have the power to declare war. Remember that quaint notion? And it was the only one that could raise the money, right? The president couldn't do that. The president just, his power kicked in once we were at war, and then he was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So some good stuff, not all of it, but some good stuff got into the Constitution in this regard. But some of the Anti-Federalists would not sign on. And George Mason was described as being for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. And Mason refused to sign or support the Constitution. Madison, who of course was the father of the Constitution, and in my book, not a hero of American history, at least understood the danger of war and the power to make war. And he said, famously, he said, in time of actual war, great discretionary powers are constantly given to the executive magistrate. Constant apprehension of war has the same tendency to render the head too large for the body. A standing military force with an overgrown executive will not long be safe companions to liberty. He goes on and on about this. He understood the dangers of war. He also called it the one offense that contains the germ of all the other offenses, right? Taxation, debt, all this other stuff, growth of government generally. Anyway, I wanted to bring this to your attention because it's important that we know that earlier Americans had this attitude toward the military, which has been almost totally forgotten. Even in the Federalist Papers, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay felt they needed to sell the Constitution as containing this anti-militarist sentiment because most people shared it. But unfortunately, once they got into power, they sort of forgot about it. And E. Kirch writes, after the Constitution was adopted, its staunchest supporters readily forgot the interpretation of the document that they had offered in the heat of the struggle for ratification. Never forget that the Federalist Papers are these venerated documents, right? Everybody bows down to the Federalist Papers. Great political philosophy, great writing. I studied them in school in a class that was related to rhetoric, not to political philosophy. They were used as great examples of persuasive writing. It was ad copy. Let's never forget, these were newspaper articles selling the Constitution. And when the soap company tells you their soap is the greatest, all of us, by the time we get to age 13 or something, know that that may not be the literal truth. Because, of course, they would say that. They sell the soap. They make the soap. So keep this in mind when you hear talk about the Federalist Papers, that they were trying to sell something. And as Merrill Jensen pointed out, the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence were not the same men who wrote the Constitution. So when they promised the public that the Constitution reflected their anti-militarist feelings, they were selling it. And as E. Kirch points out, and Jensen points out, and others point out, once the Constitution was ratified, and that was behind them, they then behaved in some different way. Luckily, the public sentiment and the pressure of the Anti-Federalists were still able to keep things in rein for a while, but then that faded, and the Nationalists more and more had the free rein. Okay, let me stop with that part of it, and since I have to wind down, I want to close on this idea that the government protects us and that the government is sort of all wise and would only be acting in the interest of the American people. I want to close with a quotation, which I then will explain a bit after reading it. It's easy for them to provoke and bait this administration. All they have to do is send 2 mujahideen to the furthest point east to raise a piece of cloth on which is written Al-Qaeda, in order to make the generals race there to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses without their achieving for it anything of note other than some benefits for their private companies. So they are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy. That being said, when one scrutinizes the results, one cannot say that Al-Qaeda is the sole factor in achieving those spectacular gains. Rather, the policy of the White House that demands the opening of war fronts to keep busy their various corporations, whether they be working in the field of arms or oil or reconstruction, has helped Al-Qaeda to achieve these enormous results. And so it appears to some analysts and diplomats that the White House and they are playing as one team toward the economic goals of the United States, even if the intentions differ. Okay, this is a very revealing quotation, right? And if someone were to say this, they'd be denounced, of course, as a hater of America, pointing out that there's almost a tacit alliance, not a explicit alliance between the administration and Al-Qaeda. Obviously not. That's not the point here. They say for different intentions, but it's as if they were in an alliance. And anything Al-Qaeda does becomes a justification, or anything anybody claiming to be Al-Qaeda, right? I mean, it don't have to be Al-Qaeda. Anything they do is a new pretext for the administration to exercise power, because they have this perfect justification, protection from terrorism. By the way, I'm waiting for the day when some group does something somewhere and claims they're Al-Qaeda, and bin Laden goes into court and sues over trademark, saying, they're not Al-Qaeda. Hey, we have standards to keep up. They're a bunch of amateurs, and we resent them using our brand name, and we're suing. And I'm waiting for this to happen any day now, because can anybody say they're Al-Qaeda? Now, by the way, I didn't tell you who said this statement. I changed some of the pronouns. Everywhere it said they, it was really we. That was a statement by bin Laden, 2004. I have a feeling bin Laden, I mean, I'm no fan of bin Laden, obviously, but he has some insights that hasn't yet, well, maybe they have filtered to the administration and they can't afford to admit them to us, but he at least sees that Bush and the crowd up there, or not far from here, have let themselves, because they benefit from this, have put themselves in the position where bin Laden can call the shots, right? Because anything he does, they can then use to say, this is why we need to exercise more power. So that gives him quite an initiative, right? Boy, somebody allegedly uses a gel or thinks about using a gel to blow up an airplane, and suddenly we can't have gels on airplanes anymore. So who's calling the shots here? I remember when they accused Ron Paul of taking his marching orders from, what was it, the terrorists or Al-Qaeda? Remember somebody accused him of that? And who really is taking the marching orders from Al-Qaeda? It's the administration, because it serves the purposes to do that. There was a book written years ago. Well, it wasn't. The title was apt, but it wasn't actually about what I'm going to say. Called "Indispensable Enemies," and I always thought that applied to in the Cold War, right? The Russian ruling elite and the U.S. ruling elite needed each other because they just played off each other. There was it was a reason for taxes and regulations and conscription at one point and all kinds of things going into Vietnam.